Now the next step is to clean off the sides of the leather top sole. If I'm going to use a rubber sole, materials that make up the sole are going to be totally different. So I can go ahead and clean this edge and it'll work fine. But if I'm going to use a leather bottom sole, then I need to wait until the sole is all cemented together, and then I smooth both pieces at the same time, both the top and bottom sole. So if I'm going to do this now, I'll show you some of the tools some of the options that you have of tools. This is a rasp, so that will, if I go with the sole edge like this, I can get it smoothed off. I can also use a sponge, a sanding sponge, and this might be best when it's wet, but it just works like this to get that edge. Maybe some of your scissor cuts left little divots, so you want to get that all smoothed off. And just an emery board will work too. So once we get that edge kind of smooth, then the next thing to do is when you sand it, a little edge might raise up around the edge, and I don't want that, so I will get some water on this little sponge and go over the edge. And then I'll use a tool called an edger and go along here and see wherever there's that little ridge that's formed. I'll take it off. There's not too much here. Get a little curly piece. And after that, I can use something called a chemical called gum tragacanth, or I can use beeswax. So I'm going to use beeswax and then a burnishing tool like this. You can see this one could get hooked up to a drill with that hole in it, and this one can also be hooked up to a drill to smooth out the beeswax and seal all the pores along the edge of the sole, so it gives it a nice smooth appearance. And then I will coat it with the edge with beeswax. So this is a candle, and then I'll go over this edge with this burnisher. So I'm right now just burnishing in this area so you can see what happens. So it's probably pretty hard to see that this is kind of nicely rounded. It's very light leather, so you can't see it quite as well, but it's rounded on both top and bottom edge because this burnisher was the right size for that to fit into and to kind of seal the edges also. So you would do this process all the way around the sole. If you are making your bottom sole out of natural rubber, really cut it so that I'm really pulling on with this thumb and fingers below it so that I don't make little divots on the side, because it's really hard in fact I haven't really been able to do it, to sand the edges so they're smooth by hand. I can smooth the edges with a belt sander, so if you have one of those, great. And it looks like there's some little rough spots, so I'll use a belt sander to sand that smooth. When you sand it, it changes the look of this outside edge. So it's, if you sand it in one little spot to take off something that's not smooth, do the whole sole so it will all have the same appearance. Here's my new favorite way to store the Aqualim 315 or EcoWeld non-toxic cement, is to put it in these picnic ketchup bottles, as described by Lisa Sorrell, and I squirted some down the center here, and then I'm using this brush that I keep in a little jar, and I made a hole in the lid with a punch. And so any other container starts to look pretty grimy after a short time. So having these inexpensive, simple kind of containers is really helpful. So I'm putting a natural rubber sole cemented to this top sole. I'm going to take some of that excess glue off here, put it over here. And then if I need a little more, I'll give another little squirt and spread that out. This is a acid brush from Harbor Freight. You get a bunch of them for practically nothing. Okay. Take a while, especially for the natural rubber to dry, so I'll put it under a fan to speed it up a little bit. The cement has dried, so I will be now lining these two layers up. First, getting the toe right, as you can see, and working my way back and seeing that I've got this area right, and then I think it's time to press down and seal these two together. Next we'll punch out the stitching holes. I'm using the same topsole to show you what to do if you have both top and bottom soles made out of the vegetable tan leather. But first we'll get them lined up at the toe, then work our way back here and get that right. And it looks like they've lined up back there. So now I will be sanding and burnishing these edges together. See, there's just a little discrepancy from, well, if you can see that not all those red marks are exactly in that groove. And with the leather bottom sole, I'm going to make the same groove in the bottom sole. So I need to do that when the top sole and the bottom sole have been cemented together. And then I sand the edges and burnish them, and then I use the groover so that it's going to be the same distance from the edge on both the top and the bottom. So the groove on the top is kind of light, just to show where to place the stitches. If you plan to have a vegetable tan leather bottom sole, it needs to have a groove in it so the stitches are pulled up a bit, protected a bit, and we'll be making the holes from the top sole so they'll look good on the top, but we also want them to go into the groove on the bottom. I've put the bands through the slots and tried on the sandal, and it fit very nicely. So then I punched stitch holes here, since this end of the band goes under in this direction and the other turns out to be caught in the seam stitching. So I'm just going in and out of these holes, and then when I get back to where I started, I'll tie a knot here on the back of the sandal. And the stitching will be complete. I'll tie a knot here and ready for the next step. So I'm ready to punch holes through both layers. I'll cement on this natural rubber below here, and then I'll pull the stitches very tight so that it's compressed and the stitches aren't laying on the ground. I checked the bands and they fit very nicely. So ready for the finishing steps. Since I have a vegetable tan leather top sole and bottom sole, I want to sand and burnish the edges and then make the stitching grooves. It's important to do this on the bottom of the sole, as I've said, so that the stitches are tucked up inside the leather a bit so they don't get worn through. But I'm going to make a similar groove on the top sole, so I'll know that when I punch holes here, they're going to go directly down into the groove on the bottom sole. So that means I'm waiting until after I have made the groove to mark where the stitch holes go. And so to do that, I copied the stitch marks from this pattern here, and then I'm going to transfer them onto here. So I'll use my silver pen and mark these, and then we'll punch.